Hey guys, tonight we drift gently across a glassy lake where the stars reflect so perfectly that you're not quite sure where the sky ends and the water begins. In the distance, you spot strange green rafts bobbing lightly on the surface, floating islands, stitched together with mud, reeds, and something like ancient ingenuity. A fine mist curls around your ankles, and the air smells faintly of moist earth, lake weed, and the whisper of something very old. Welcome to Tenochtitlan, not quite the city it once was, but alive in memory tonight. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our sleepy little history crew spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're gliding silently in a canoe carved from cypress wood, the paddle slipping through the water without a splash. On either side of you, the floating gardens of the Aztecs rise like patchwork puzzle pieces stitched into the lake. These are the chinampas. And though they look simple, just long rectangles of green, they're actually one of the most sophisticated agricultural systems ever developed, and yeah, you probably wouldn't last a day farming them. Each chinampa is built like a lasagna of lake life, a base of interwoven willow or ahujoke branches, anchored deep into the lakebed with poles. Then come the layers of aquatic mud, decomposing plant matter, and topsoil hauled in by hand, or rather, by many hands, over many moons. These gardens don't float in the way a raft might, they're semi-floating, tethered to the earth beneath and held in place by roots and stakes, a blend of stability and buoyancy that even today's botanists squint sideways at. The year is somewhere in the early 1500s. You can't be sure, because Aztec calendars don't follow the neat 12-month format you're used to. But you do know it's morning. There's a gentle hum of life as farmers paddle out, kneel barefoot in the mud, and begin their day with a rhythm that's part ritual, part muscle memory. Historians still argue whether these chinampas were entirely human-made or whether the Aztecs adapted pre-existing lake islets into garden platforms. Either way, the result is mesmerizing. Each narrow strip stretches about 30 meters long, like a green raft on a mirror, and they're spaced just wide enough for a canoe to glide between them. The canals function both as irrigation and transportation. It's like Venice and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon had a very eco-friendly baby. From your cozy perch, wrapped in a wool cloak that someone kindly handed you as a guest, you watch a young gardener jab a wooden digging stick into the soil. He's checking for moisture, not because he read it in a manual, but because his grandmother told him the soil should feel like the back of a frog on a cloudy day. Aztec farming wisdom didn't always translate cleanly into English, but it sure painted a picture. A dragonfly flits past your nose. You try not to swat it. Dragonflies were considered lucky here, silent watchers of the lake. Also, they eat mosquitoes. Lots of them. You owe that dragonfly some respect. The plants on these floating islands aren't just for show. You see the triumvirate that fed an empire, maize, beans, and squash. But that's for later. For now, your eyes trace the tidy rows, the way each plant seems to know where it belongs, as if whispered instructions through the soil. And in a way, they were. Each plot is cultivated with an eerie precision, passed down through oral knowledge and a fine-tuned relationship with the lake's pulse. Chinampas weren't static. They were alive, built up season by season. Every year, more sediment was added, more reeds interlaced, more time baked into their roots. And they didn't just grow food. They grew community. Families passed down chinampas like heirlooms. Marriages were arranged with these floating fields as dowries. You begin to understand why losing one in a storm or drought wasn't just economic, it was personal. You pass by a farmer who pauses, stands, and raises a clay jug to the sun. He pours a little into the water. A ritual offering, perhaps to Tlaloc, the rain god with bulging eyes and jaguar fangs. Or maybe he's just saluting the lake for not swallowing his corn this week. It's hard to say. Back in the present, botanists from several countries have tried recreating chinampas. They've gotten close. But there's always something off, the soil's never quite right. Or the hydrology doesn't balance. One researcher swore the secret ingredient was duck droppings. Another blamed the modern air pollution. Yet another blamed vibes. Scientific term pending. The truth is, the Aztec relationship with the land was part technique, part belief, part long memory. You didn't just plant seeds, you asked the land, the lake, and maybe even the wind for permission. You whispered to your corn. You blessed your beans. You waited until a certain bird sang at dawn before putting your hands in the soil. You lean back in your canoe now. The water lapping gently against the wood. The chinampas sway softly beside you, like they're breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a flute plays. Not a performance, just someone working. Humming through reed holes as they plant amaranth. It's hypnotic. It's humble. It's brilliant. And tonight, as you drift deeper into this ancient lake, the floating farms of Tenochtitlan keep growing, rooted not just in mud, but in memory. You slide your canoe to the edge of one of the gardens and step out carefully. The chinampa yielding slightly underfoot but not sinking. The earth is soft, damp, and somehow springy, like stepping onto a waterbed disguised as a vegetable patch. A nearby farmer. A woman wearing a wrap of cactus fiber cloth and a wide grin, hands you a woven basket. No instructions, just a nod. Apparently, you're helping today. You kneel beside her as she begins the day's maintenance, clearing invasive plants, loosening soil with a sharpened digging stick called a hoe, and reinforcing the chinampa's edge with fresh reeds. Reeds before rain, she says quietly, nodding toward the morning sky. You glance up. It's a clear blue. But you nod too, like you understand. Apparently, the reeds know something you don't. You watch as she pulls bundles of a hujote, a willow tree unique to this region, from her canoe. These are no ordinary trees. They are the chinampa's bones. Their roots bind the floating soil layers together, their trunks mark the garden's borders, and their leafy branches offer just enough shade to keep the squash vines from shriveling. They're like organic scaffolding, constantly growing, constantly stabilizing. Historians still argue whether these trees were deliberately planted in such specific geometries from the start, or whether that evolved naturally over generations. What's certain is that without them, the chinampas would collapse into floating compost within weeks. With them, they become durable. Living structures, farms and forests in one. As you dig your hands into the rich black mud, you feel how strangely alive it is. It smells sweet, peaty, and just a touch fishy. Not gross fishy. More like lake breeze through an open windowed fishy. The mud is scooped directly from the canal floor, laden with nutrients, tiny creatures, and microscopic elements that, if you're being honest, probably explain why your skin feels unusually smooth right now. Once enough mud is hauled up, it's spread over the chinampa in thin layers, then mixed with plant matter, old corn husks, and shredded reeds. It's like frosting a giant cake, if the cake was also sentient and kind of humid. This, your new friend explains, is the layering technique. Mud. Biomass. Mud. Biomass. Repeat until the garden sits just above the waterline, high enough to avoid drowning, low enough to soak in moisture like a sponge. It's beautifully low-tech. So low-tech, in fact, that modern agronomists still struggle to replicate its balance without pumps, sensors, and spreadsheets. Your hands are filthy, your knees are damp, and yet you feel oddly peaceful. There's something about the rhythm here. The water, the plants, the people, the way no one's ever in a rush, but somehow everything gets done. A boy, maybe 10, steers a tiny canoe past you with his elbow. In the back is a pile of fresh-cut reeds, so neatly stacked it could pass for art. He waves. Doesn't say a word. Just nods at your muddy face like you're one of them now. You feel irrationally proud. By midday, the sun is warm but not punishing. The canopy of willows throws dappled shadows across the water. You break for a snack, roasted maize and a chunk of fermented cactus fruit that smells like gym socks but tastes surprisingly citrusy. Apparently, it also keeps mosquitoes away. Nature's snack and bug repellent, all in one. Move over, trail mix. You sit back against a reed bundle and admire the shape of the chinampa, long and narrow, like a green barge. Every so often, a farmer glides past, scooping water with a good ladle and pouring it gently into their garden's base. The water doesn't flood. It soaks in evenly, like a sponge, disappearing within seconds. You tilt your head. It shouldn't work this well. But it does. That's kind of the whole story here. One old man, perched like a frog on a log, swears the secret is in the original lake bed. It remembers the shape of the gardens, he tells you in a voice like crushed gravel. So they settle back into place, even after storms. You don't know if that's poetic nonsense or geological truth. But either way, you write it down in your mind. You notice something else, each garden is slightly tilted. Not enough to see right away, but enough to encourage runoff. Rain doesn't pool. It slides. In slow, deliberate trails, back into the canals. It's not just farming. It's hydraulic sculpture. The whole system works in concert with the lake itself, not against it. You recall reading once that the Spanish, upon invading Tenochtitlan, marveled at these gardens. One conquistador wrote that the city floated upon the water like a dream. They were so confused by the chinampas that they described them as enchanted plots. Floating, producing food year-round, immune to drought, and appearing to defy gravity. The Spaniards didn't figure out how to preserve them. In fact, they actively dismantled them, draining lakes to make proper land, paving what had once floated. To them, it seemed like superstition. To you, it feels like an ecological masterpiece hidden in plain sight. Today, in the outskirts of Mexico City, a few surviving chinampas remain. Farmers still tend them, often with the same tools. The same calloused hands, and the same stubborn trust in mud, roots, and rhythm. And here, in this drifting dream of green and water, you begin to understand. The real genius of the Aztecs wasn't just their temples or their calendars or their gold. It was their dirt. Their ability to build entire ecosystems out of silt and sticks. And if that doesn't make you rethink every houseplant you've ever accidentally killed, well, maybe you just need a chinampa of your own. The afternoon light settles gently across the water. And everything shimmers gold and green. You recline against a bundle of freshly cut reeds, the kind used for weaving baskets, mats, even roofs. They smell faintly of cucumber and sunshine. It's quiet here, soothingly quiet. You can hear the distant drip of water from a paddle, the chirrup of a bird you can't name, and the occasional croak of a frog that sounds like it's been smoking cigars for 30 years. Today, the chinampas don't just grow corn or beans. They grow knowledge, passed down not through books, but through fingers in the dirt, sun on your neck, and 100 generations whispering, "This is how we've always done it." It's humbling. And itchy. Because you're pretty sure something is crawling down your collar, but we're going to ignore that. You get up and stroll along a narrow strip of hardened soil connecting two chinampas. Like a sleepy green catwalk. Ahead, you see a woman planting something that looks suspiciously like marigolds. You ask, with what little tilmatli you remember, "Is that food?" She laughs gently and shakes her head. No. But it feeds the food. The Aztecs, it turns out, were deeply into companion planting, a technique where you grow different plants together because they help each other out. Marigolds keep pests away with their sharp scent. Beans fix nitrogen in the soil. Squash sprawls to block weeds and shade the ground. It's like a botanical buddy system. You kneel beside a patch of this three sisters combo: maize, beans, and squash. The maize grows tall and straight, a natural trellis for the beans to climb. The beans wind around the stalks, clinging like sleepy toddlers. At the base, the squash fans out with giant leaves the size of serving platters. It's genius. It's elegant. It's the original food forest, before anyone started using that term on TikTok. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs learned this method from their neighbors to the north, or whether it evolved independently. Either way, they turned it into high art. And they didn't just do it on land. They did it on floating mud rafts, with no metal tools. And they somehow made it look effortless. Further down the garden, a man is delicately moving a young tomato plant. Yes, tomatoes. Native to the Americas. Bet you didn't think of that the last time you ate pizza. The Aztecs called them tilmatli. And they treated them like precious jewels. Grown with care, pruned with obsidian blades so sharp they could split a hair. The plants are nestled between clumps of amaranth and chili peppers. You reach out and gently touch one of the tomato leaves. It smells sharp and green, with a hint of nightshade mystery. You ask why they're planted next to the amaranth, and the farmer says, "They argue less this way." You chuckle, but he's serious. Some plants, he explains, compete for nutrients or attract the same bugs. Others just get along. Garden harmony. You're starting to think the Aztecs knew something we still haven't quite grasped. As the breeze picks up, you notice rows of unfamiliar plants, one with feathery red fronds, another with stubby purple blossoms. You ask the nearest farmer, who tells you those are medicinal herbs. One to settle the stomach, one to cool fevers, one to help with sleeplessness, though ironically, you don't catch the name because your eyes are starting to droop just looking at it. It wasn't all food and medicine, though. The Aztecs also used the chinampas to grow plants for dyes, rituals, even incense. Copal trees, whose resin was burned during ceremonies. Flowers for offerings, marigolds again, always marigolds. In Aztec culture, flowers weren't just pretty, they were sacred, symbolic of life's fragility and its beauty. You feel a bit bad for every grocery store bouquet you've ever treated like an afterthought. Suddenly, a child runs past, giggling, carrying a small pot of chili seedlings. Her grandmother follows behind at a more leisurely pace, humming softly. You watch them plant the chilies carefully along the edge of the garden, near the waterline. Apparently, this keeps the roots cooler. You make a mental note, maybe that's why your balcony jalapenos always look so resentful. The sun tilts lower, and a soft rustle moves through the ahujo trees. A bird lands nearby, a glossy black with a curved beak and bright red eyes. You freeze, thinking you're witnessing something rare. The old man from before chuckles. "Just a swamp grackle," he says. "They gossip more than they fly." You realize he's right. The bird is making a noise somewhere between a squawk and a theatrical sigh. Botanists today have catalogued over 60 crops that were grown on chinampas, sweet potato, taro, luffa, charlotte, vanilla orchid. Each one was placed where it would thrive best. It was a constant balancing act, sun versus shade, wet versus dry, hungry roots versus modest ones. And no chemical fertilizers. Just fish, muck, and time. You pass another gardener tending to a small, delicate plant with blue-green leaves. He tells you its episode, an herb used in bin dishes, not just for flavor, but to reduce, let's say, musical side effects. You wonder aloud if that's why the Aztecs could farm in such tight quarters. He nods gravely. Peaceful digestion builds peaceful community. Wise words. Historians still puzzle over just how the Aztecs kept yield so high with no crop rotation. The answer seems to lie in how alive their soil was, rich with compost, constantly replenished by canal mud and organic detritus. They didn't need to rotate much because they were always feeding the soil itself. A living loop. And as you stretch out once more beneath the dappled willow canopy, the thought strikes you gently, this wasn't just farming. This was choreography. Plants, people, water, wind, soil, all moving in step. Not to dominate nature, but to dance with it. You wake from your little daydream, or maybe it was a nap, with the sensation that time here is, at best, optional. The sun has moved slightly across the sky, but the scene remains nearly the same, green canals, drifting clouds, rustling trees. Except now, something new is happening. A group of farmers, men and women of all ages, are gathering at the water's edge, forming a slow-moving chain with baskets in hand. You wander closer and are handed a small, curved basket made of tightly woven reeds. No one explains, but everyone smiles as though you already know what to do. So you follow the flow. One by one. You scoop into the water along the canal edge, pulling up something rich, dark, and squishy, lake mud. This is no ordinary mud. It's ancient. Nutrient-dense sediment dredged from the bottom of the lake, full of decomposed vegetation, fish droppings, algae, and thyme. The Aztecs called it tilmatli, or sacred earth. You gently pour your basket's haul onto a growing mound at the base of a chinampa. This is today's rebuilding work. A kind of botanical maintenance. Every few days, the gardens are fed this black gold, keeping them buoyant and fertile. It's like giving a houseplant fresh soil, if that houseplant were a floating farm the size of a city block. The process is soothingly repetitive: scoop, carry, pour. There's no shouting, no urgency, just a collective rhythm. And the smell, earthy, slightly fishy, with a hint of clean lake breeze, somehow makes you hungrier than it should. Historians still argue how frequently the Aztecs dredged the canals or whether it varied by season or crop. Some suggest it was an intuitive practice tied to rainfall patterns. Others insist it was calendrical, aligned with the complex Aztec solar cycle. You just know your arms are starting to feel like noodles, and no one else looks winded. Humbling. As you wipe your hands on your tunic, let's pretend it's a tunic now, you notice the water level in the canal has shifted slightly. A nearby farmer points to a clever water gate system. A series of weirs and sluices made from stone, wood, and packed reeds. These weren't just for directing water, they managed depth, slowed erosion, and regulated flow between garden sections. It dawns on you, these people weren't just farmers. They were hydrologists. The canals themselves were part of the infrastructure. Not obstacles to be overcome, but veins and arteries of a living system. Water wasn't something they controlled. It was something they courted. Later in the afternoon, you're invited to help with seed drying. It's a delicate affair. On a flat mat woven from maguey fiber, dozens of small piles of seeds are carefully arranged under partial sun. Some are covered with sheer cloth to protect from birds. Others are fanned occasionally by children who look suspiciously professional with palm leaf fans. Each seed is labeled, not with ink, but with tiny arrangements of pebbles and shells that indicate species and planting order. You marvel at the quiet ingenuity. Nothing is wasted, and yet nothing feels rushed. You hold a few seeds in your palm, peppery, warm, oddly comforting. They carry hundreds of generations inside them, and yet weigh next to nothing. A farmer, older than the trees it seems, squats beside you and explains how certain seeds are never planted all at once. Some you save for drought, some for flood, some for war. You nod as if you understand, but your brain hiccups at the word war. You'd almost forgotten this serene paradise was once part of a fierce empire. The Aztec military machine was vast and efficient. And yet here, in the Chinampas, you see almost none of that. These were sacred spaces used for food, healing, and ritual. You realize this place isn't about conquest. It's about resilience. These gardens were the backup plan, the survival net, the pantry that never ran empty. That's not just clever. That's visionary. As the last of the mud hauling ends, the group gathers for a shared meal. You're handed a bowl of atoll, a warm, thick maize drink sweetened with honey and flavored with vanilla and cinnamon. It tastes like comfort, like liquid breakfast, like something your great-great-grandmother would have made if she had a clay pot and a floating farm. A side dish arrives in a small good bowl, amaranth green sautéed with squash blossoms, topped with a sprinkle of toasted pumpkin seeds. It's absurdly good. You consider moving here. Like, permanently. Conversation hums around you in a mix of nahuatl, laughter, and long pauses. People here are good at pausing. It's not awkward, it's luxurious. Like even speech is a crop that grows best with space and sunlight. You're told the best Chinamperos, those who tend the floating gardens, are part farmer, part priest, part engineer. They read the water levels like scripture, know when to plant by the moon, and whisper to the plants as they prune. Whether that's spiritual or just good acoustics, no one seems in a rush to clarify. You stretch your legs and notice the way shadows have lengthened across the canals. The water glows faintly pink, catching the sky's blush like a shy reflection. You hear someone softly singing an old planting song, the kind without words, just melody and breath. It feels older than language. Your eyes flutter. You lean back. And just before your thoughts begin to dissolve into dream stuff, you think, this isn't a lost world. It's still here. Beneath the city, beneath the concrete and car horns, this gentle, waterbound wisdom still floats, still feeds, still waits. A warm breeze rustles your hair as the scent of damp earth, sun-warmed leaves, and faint, floral sweetness weaves its way through the air. You're lying on a reed mat now, somewhere between dreaming and dozing, and the light through the willow canopy above dapples your face in patterns older than memory. A quiet splash draws your attention, just a canoe gliding by, its prow laden with squash and chayote, the paddler trailing lazy ripples behind like a water snake in no hurry. You sit up slowly, your bones grateful for the pause, and glance over at a group of children laughing near a Chinampa's edge. They're gathered around a strange, boxy device made of carved wooden goods. You wander over and realize it's not a toy at all. It's a seed-sorting rattle, a tool that sings as you shake it. The tone shifts slightly depending on seed size. Each child takes turns shaking, then scooping seeds into woven pouches. It's part game, part lesson, part quality control. This is what the Aztecs did so well. They embedded education in everyday life. Farming wasn't a job, it was life itself, and children learned by doing. By touching, smelling, listening. No blackboards, no lectures. Just soil, water, and wisdom passed hand to hand. Nearby, an older woman is sketching diagrams in the dirt with a stick. She's outlining planting layouts, not rows, but spirals, triangles, even grids. You've stepped into the world of Aztec garden design, and it's far more than aesthetics. These layouts optimized sunlight angles, controlled runoff, and even kept pests guessing. Historians still debate whether these patterns had symbolic meanings, cosmic maps, perhaps, or references to gods like Tlaloc and Chicomicoatl, the deities of rain and grain. Or maybe the patterns were just beautiful. As you watch the lines swirl and intersect, you realize that beauty wasn't a byproduct here, it was built in. A sudden flurry of dragonflies zips past your shoulder, their gossamer wings catching the light like living jewels. You're drawn toward the water, where something shimmers beneath the surface. Bending closer, you notice an arrangement of stones forming a low underwater wall, a fish trap, centuries old. These weren't just gardens, they were aquaponic systems before anyone coined the term. Tilapia, axolotls, and small carp-like fish swam in the canals. Waste from the fish fertilized the plants. In return, the plant roots filtered the water. A quiet, ongoing barter. No pumps, no wires. Just balance. The Aztecs even designed floating nests for birds that attracted pollinators and pest eaters, like herons, ducks, and kingfishers. You squint and spot one now, a rough circle of reeds, bobbing gently, with a very smug-looking egret perched in the center. Behind you, a young man is brushing something onto a clay tablet. You ask what it is, and he proudly tells you it's pulverized orchid root mixed with tree sap, an early form of glue used to label garden tools or wrap seed bundles. Aztecs loved plants so much. They even used them to make adhesives. Somewhere, a modern craft store is weeping with envy. Then comes a sound like wind chimes, but softer. You follow it to a line of hanging shells swaying between two posts. They're not decorative. They're pest deterrents. When the wind blows, they clatter gently, scaring off birds and beetles without harming them. You smile, so much of Aztec gardening seems to involve asking nicely before escalating. You pass a patch of strange, waxy plants with thick, clubbed stems and ask their purpose. The gardener tilts his head. They shade the roots, and sometimes they bite. You laugh, thinking he's joking. He is not. Welcome to stingless wasp gardening, where certain insects are deliberately cultivated to control others. Even the bugs are team players. Historians still can't agree on whether these wasps were a planned element or just a happy accident. Some argue the Chinampa ecosystem created the perfect conditions for symbiotic insect colonies to flourish. Others believe gardeners actively seeded nests. Either way, you decide not to poke the waxy plants and move on. You stroll past another trio of farmers layering mulch. Not store-bought mulch, lake weed, crushed bark, and maize husks. It smells odd but rich. Like a forest floor, and a tortilla factory had a very wholesome baby. They're spreading it carefully between rows of sweet potato vines, which trail over the edges of the chinampa like green ribbons. The vines are deliberately guided into the canal so they can root again along the water line. More roots, more nutrients. More nutrients, more food. The whole place is like a slow-motion perpetual motion machine. If Rube Goldberg were a lake spirit. And then, you spot it. A narrow, elevated channel, only a few inches wide. Snaking between two chinampas. Water flows down it slowly, guided by gravity and sculpted earth. It's a mini-canal, used to redistribute excess water or even heat during cold nights. You dip a finger in. It's warmer than expected. The thermal mass of the water retains heat from the day, radiating it upward at night, keeping delicate plants from frosting. You marvel quietly. All this engineering, and it's made of sticks, stones, mud, and patience. No diesel, no concrete. Just deep time and deeper trust in nature. Even the scarecrow off in the distance seems unusually elegant. It's shaped like a jaguar, covered in shiny mica flakes that catch the sun. A shimmering guardian of maize. Not terrifying. Just dignified. You exhale deeply, realizing you haven't looked at a clock in hours. Maybe the sun is lower. Maybe time's just stopped. You glance at the water. A single ripple expands outward, reflecting sky, trees, and your sleepy grin. The chinampas hum softly around you, or not a sound you hear, but a rhythm you feel. And slowly, dreamily, you stretch your arms, dust off your knees, and prepare to wander further into this floating, fertile labyrinth. You drift again, this time along the canal in a small canoe, its smooth hull carved from a single tree. The paddle dips soundlessly, sending you past plots of maize and herbs, over floating reflections that ripple into mirrored constellations. On either side, the chinampas seem to stretch on endlessly. An emerald maze where water and garden blur into one. A man in the boat with you, or chinampero whose hands look permanently stained with soil, tells you that today you're going to help with crop rotation planning. You raise an eyebrow. It sounds like an Excel spreadsheet in dirt form. But as he unfolds a painted cloth map and starts pointing to colored squares and feathered icons, your curiosity perks up. Turns out, crop rotation here isn't just about avoiding soil fatigue. It's a multi-seasonal dance involving companion planting, moon phases, and pest cycles. Beans follow maize. Squash follows amaranth. But not just anywhere. There are rules, customs, superstitions, and even family-specific traditions. Your guide taps a square and murmurs, "That's where my grandmother said we never plant chili after the rain ceremony." You nod solemnly, because honestly, that sounds like something grandmothers just know. Historians still argue how standardized these systems were. Some chinampas appear to follow empire-wide agricultural calendars. Others show signs of more independent, local governance. The Aztecs had layers of control, but also, evidently, room for the wisdom of aunties. You step off the boat near a shaded plot of medicinal herbs. The smell hits you instantly, eucalyptus, epazote, and something sharp and resinous you can't name. A young girl sits cross-legged, carefully bundling leaves with twine. Her teacher, a curandera in training, explains that this garden is a special one, not for eating, but for healing. You trace your fingers over leaves of tlalchichichi and copalquin. Your guide hands you a leaf of minty-sweet momoxley and suggests chewing it for fatigue. You politely decline, remembering the last time you ate an unknown plant and spent 2 hours thinking you were a hummingbird. The herbalist points out dream plants, herbs burned or brewed into teas meant to encourage vivid visions. You smile, noting the irony. You're already inside the most vivid dreamscape of all. She chuckles and taps her temple. Not all gardens grow in the soil. Off to the side, a garden elder demonstrates how to fertilize using duckweed and fish emulsion. It's aromatic. You offer to help stir a vat of the green slurry, and immediately regret it. But somehow, this odorous soup translates into lettuce leaves the size of small umbrellas. The lesson? Good things grow from weird smells. You wash off the slime in a nearby canal where a group is weaving aquatic baskets, not for storage, but for planting directly into the water. These baskets are filled with soil, tied to floating logs, and then launched into open water gardens. Like little life rafts of fertility, bobbing gently toward the horizon. They're used for transitional planting, especially when Chinampa land is maxed out. The Aztecs, it seems, were masters at turning every square inch into productivity. Your guide gestures for you to follow him back into the canoe, and this time you head toward the bee garden. You weren't expecting bees in a place with no large trees. But these aren't your average European honeybees. These are stingless Melipona bees, kept in hollow logs and fed on flowers grown specifically for them. The honey, he tells you, is prized for medicine and ritual, not breakfast. It's tangy, thinner than you expect, and harvested with whispered prayers. The logs are marked with carved symbols, glyphs of flowers, stars, and the goddess Mayahul, patroness of nourishment. Historians still debate how central these bees were to the broader economy. Some believe they were symbolic offerings more than staples. Others argue they were vital to pollinating the delicate balance of crops that thrived here. As you listen to the soft hum of the hives, it's easy to believe both. You pass a sunlit patch filled with night-blooming plants, and your guide explains these are part of the midnight harvest, a practice saved for solstices or fertility festivals. Some plants were believed to hold stronger magic if gathered under moonlight. Others simply flourished better when touched at cooler hours. There's a quiet reverence here. Even pulling a weed seems ceremonial. Every step, every motion, is threaded with intention. You pick up a simple wooden rake and are shown how to use it, not aggressively, but gently. Almost like brushing hair. Talk to the plants, someone murmurs. Not with your mouth. With your rhythm. You trail behind a pair of older Chinamperos planting tiny seeds in tight, perfect rows using a 5-seed method, one in the center, for around the edges. It's geometric, almost like a compass rose. Protection, they say. Symmetry keeps the bad spirits bored. And honestly, bored spirits sound like the best kind. You glance up just as the sun dips lower, painting the canal gold. A chorus of frogs begins to croak. The gardens seem to breathe out, settling into evening. Your body, too, begins to sag, pleasantly warm, pleasantly full of strange facts and new muscle memory. In the distance, a reed flute plays a wandering melody, and a heron glides across the canal like a low-flying kite. You float in the canoe, drifting now not by paddle, but by current. And as the first star peeks out above the lake, you whisper, almost unconsciously, "How did we forget all of this?" No one answers. But the water, the plants, the insects, they all seem to smile back. Evening settles around you like a soft shawl, draped in humming insects and golden light. You're still drifting, this time pulled by a current you barely feel, the canoe gliding as if enchanted. The Chinampas on either side now wear long shadows like capes, and everything slows, cools, deepens. It's the hour when farmers turn into storytellers and work songs give way to laughter. You're about to discover that gardening here doesn't end with the harvest. Oh no. The Aztecs knew how to celebrate their soil. Your canoe noses up to a small landing. A circle of people sits around a fire pit, its smoke spiraling lazily into the dusk. You step out and join them. Drawn by the scent of roasted maize and some kind of spiced cocoa bubbling in a clay pot. A woman stirs it with a carved stick, then hands you a cup. It's bitter, floral, with a hint of something peppery. You blink. She nods knowingly. Cacao mixed with chili and vanilla orchid root, she says. It wakes the ancestors. You hope it lets you sleep later, but for now, it's delicious. Tonight is a garden blessing ceremony, a ritual held at the end of the third planting cycle, just before the dry season teases the edges of the chinampas. The group offers small bundles of seeds to the fire: teosintol, kia, amaranth, pumpkin, beans, each one named aloud, as though saying goodbye to friends. Children scatter crushed marigold petals, and a flute player summons notes that seem older than air. One farmer stands and begins a chant. You recognize a few words: Tali for earth, Atl for water, Tonali for spirit. The Aztecs didn't separate nature and the divine. Each corn kernel, each droplet of irrigation water, was alive with story. This ceremony isn't a quaint sideshow, it's a crucial part of farming. Gratitude, intention, rhythm. Even the gods, it seems, expect compost. Historians still argue whether these rituals were standardized empire-wide or if each region developed its own seasonal rites. Some records show high priests conducting similar blessings in Tenochtitlan, but many of the practices seen here in the lake gardens aren't mentioned in official codices. They live instead in oral memory, passed from calloused hands to eager ears. Your host, a wiry old man with a voice like gravel soaked in honey, tells you about planting taboos. For example, you mustn't sow maize on a day when vultures fly low, or harvest beans during an eclipse, or whistle while planting squash, lest you attract a playful spirit who tangles the vines. He shrugs and grins. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's just good manners. You glance around and realize the fire circle isn't the only thing aglow. The gardens shimmer faintly with bioluminescent algae, disturbed by movement in the water. When you point it out, a young girl hands you a bundle of reeds and gestures for you to wave it through the canal. You do, and gasp as a glowing streak trails your motion like a comet's tail. We call them the stars that fell into the lake, she whispers. You smile and vow never to Google the science. Magic is better when unexplained. As the ceremony winds down, a few families begin unpacking cloth bundles. These are seed exchange satchels, filled with tiny paper packets, goods, and even feather-sealed pods. You're watching an informal trading network that keeps these gardens genetically diverse. One woman trades red amaranth for a rare black chili. Another offers a white pumpkin in exchange for river mint. There's laughter, gentle bargaining, and not a single coin exchanged. It's community, not commerce. You learn that some seeds are passed down with names: so chills maize, coyotes squash, the bitter beans of Lake Wind. They're not just plants. They're living heirlooms, each with a story attached. You hold one such packet in your hand, tiny seeds the color of coffee grounds, and are told it came from a now-vanished chinampa swallowed by the lake in a flood 40 years ago. But the seed survived, says the man. So the garden did, too. Historians still scratch their heads over the resilience of chinampa agriculture. There are periods of drought, flood, even colonial disruption, and yet, certain plots seem to bounce back, as if encoded with stubbornness. Some suspect it's the microbial richness of the lake bed. Others point to the layered soil methods that naturally rebuild fertility year after year. And some, like your host, just wink and say, it's the old gods. They hate laziness. You help pack up the circle as night thickens. Fire embers are buried. Seed bundles wrapped. But no one seems in a hurry to leave. A young couple leads a quiet, playful dance in the torchlight, stepping carefully through a mock planting grid drawn in the dirt. They're reenacting the courtship planting ritual. Where two people would sow maize and beans together, their steps mirroring the interdependent crops. If the plants get along, someone chuckles, so will the couple. A few final jokes drift into the air, one about a gardener who tried to grow cocoa on a chinampa and ended up with fish that tasted like chocolate. Another about a canal spirit that only eats yellow squash. You laugh sleepily, heart full, brain buzzing with garden lore and lake dreams. And as you return to your canoe, now lit with a small clay lantern, you look back at the gathering one last time. They are silhouetted against the reeds and moonlight, still talking, still trading seeds, still laughing. Still tending not just soil, but each other. The paddler doesn't speak. He just smiles, dips his oar, and guides you quietly away from the firelight and back into the darkness of the canal. And as you settle into the rhythm once more, rocked gently by water and memory, you realize something important. This isn't just farming. It's a way of remembering how to be human. You awaken, not from sleep, but from that drowsy edge of it, just as the canoe nudges gently against a new chinampa. It's earlier than you expected. The sky is a slate blue, not yet fully awake. Mist coils over the canals like lazy smoke, and every sound, every bird call, every ripple, seems to arrive a beat late, muffled by morning. Today, you're here to witness something rare. A seasonal reshaping. This chinampa is being rebuilt, its edges extended, its banks re-anchored with bundled reeds and branches. The process, your paddler tells you, is as ancient as the lakes themselves, but never exactly the same twice. Like patching a cloud, he jokes, handing you a bundle of twigs. You step onto the spongy surface and feel the ground subtly give beneath your weight. It's like standing on a wet sponge layered with earth and dreams. A group of workers nearby, waist deep in the canal, hauls up great armfuls of lake muck, black, silty, and dense with nutrients. This isn't chinampa compost, a rich slurry of decayed plants, fish droppings, and thyme. They shovel it onto the chinampa base, smoothing it out with wide wooden paddles. You try your hand at it. The paddle feels awkward at first, too wide, too heavy. But then you find a rhythm, like frosting a giant earthy cake. With each stroke, the land grows thicker, darker, more alive. Historians still debate the exact layering technique. Was it always alternating rows of mud, reeds, and ash? Or did different families have secret recipes? Some sources suggest crushed freshwater mussels were added for calcium. Others insist certain flower petals discouraged insects. There's no blueprint, only generations of muddy hands remembering what works. You pause to watch two men construct a floating barrier from tied juniper branches, driven into the lakebed in parallel rows. Between them, they wedge slabs of mud, sod, and woven mats. These slow erosion and catch debris, like a natural levee system. One of the men turns and grins. Better than concrete, and smells worse. A child nearby is planting marigolds and mint along the chinampa's edge. You ask why. She answers with a shrug, keeps away the bad bugs. And the sad moods. Practical and poetic, exactly your speed. You wander farther inland, where a pair of workers rake the soil into perfect lines. The rows curve slightly, like the grain of wood, following some unseen logic. It turns out they're using a technique called contour farming, even in these small spaces, to help water distribute evenly. It's a whisper of a hill on a landscape that's otherwise as flat as glass. But the effect is mesmerizing. You can feel the intelligence beneath every furrow. You're handed a basket of seed balls, mud-packed spheres containing a mix of beans, squash, and herbs. Tossed onto moist earth, they sprout when ready, no digging required. Some believe this method came from birds, leftover seeds growing wherever they dropped. Others think it was a response to warfare, a way to sow in haste and harvest in peace. You try your hand at it. There's something oddly satisfying about tossing a mud ball into fertile earth. Like playing catch with the future. A little farther on, you find a man kneeling beside a gourd with a hole cut in the top. Curious, you crouch beside him. He taps the gourd lightly and tilts it forward. Water pours out slowly, in a steady drip, into the base of a young plant. It's an ancient form of subsurface irrigation, perfect for dry spells. It's like feeding babies, he says. Slow, patient, and a little messy. Historians still argue how widespread these gourds were. Some say they were only used on specialty crops like cocoa or peppers. Others believe entire chinampas once glittered with them, little earthbound constellations, each one nurturing a root. The goods are biodegradable, of course, and eventually melt into the soil they fed. An elegant exit. Nearby, a team is gathering up lake plants, water lilies, algae mats, duckweed, and blending them into a paste using stone mortars. This slurry is then used as a kind of natural mulch, spread thinly across the soil surface. It keeps moisture in, weeds out. Plus, it smells, well, distinctive, but effective. One woman offers you a clump to smell. You hesitate. She laughs. Come on. It's like lake perfume. You sniff. It's earthy, a little sweet, and okay, not terrible. She nods. Smells like dinner to the plants. Later, you help set up shade canopies made of agave fiber, used to protect seedlings from midday sun. The fabric is loose woven, breathable, and biodegradable. You watch as the wind plays gently through it, casting shifting patterns on the soil. It's like a living roof, temporary and tender. One elder whispers, even plants like a little comfort. And finally, just before noon, you sit with a group resting in the shade of a willow. They pass around small cups of fermented corn drink, slightly fizzy, slightly sour. Refreshing. Reviving. Someone plays a shell rattle. Someone else hums a song about frogs and melons. You don't understand all the words, but the tune feels like home. The rebuilt chinampa stretches behind you now, new. Lush, quietly miraculous. The lake laps against its edges, as if blessing the effort. You lay back in the grass and close your eyes, stomach full, hands dirty, spirit oddly light. And as dragonflies hover and the breeze smells of wet earth and lime flowers, you think, maybe we're not supposed to conquer nature. Maybe we're just supposed to coax it gently into remembering how to thrive. The sun stands higher now, filtered through reeds and shifting clouds. And your canoe drifts toward the southernmost edge of the chinampa zone. The neat rows of crops grow fewer here, replaced by experimental plots and what looks like an outdoor laboratory made of mud and sunlight. You're about to meet the fringe thinkers of the Aztec gardening world, the tinkerers, the herbalists, the soil whisperers. The first person you meet is a man in a feathered cloak, not a warrior's kind, more like a biologist who likes to make an entrance. He waves you over to a corner plot where he's growing an unusually dense patch of cress, water spinach, and a strange purplish algae. He doesn't speak at first, just hands you a small bowl and gestures for you to drink. You hesitate. The last time someone handed you mystery water, you ended up tasting spicy cocoa that summoned ghosts. But you sip. It's fresh, lightly peppery, almost green tasting. Algae tea, he says. For digestion. And for talking to ducks. You glance around. There are, in fact, several ducks standing nearby, watching solemnly, as if judging your taste in infusions. This section of the Chinampa is devoted to companion planting and microclimate experiments. You see rows of beans trained to crawl not just up corn stalks, but along willow trellises, whose leaves provide shade. Beneath the trellises, gourds, herbs, and a carefully controlled colony of ants. The man explains that some ants, if kept well fed, deter caterpillars and beetles from climbing into crops. It's all about deals, he shrugs. Even bugs make them. Historians still puzzle over the range of symbiotic pairings in Aztec agriculture. Some are obvious, like the classic three sisters of maize, beans, and squash. Others, like co-planting chilies with amaranth to confuse weevils, are found in oral tradition but lack hard documentation. Which makes sense. If you're onto something clever, why would you write it down for rivals to steal? You walk past a small fenced area, where a woman tends what look like miniature volcanoes made of mud and crushed shell. These are soil fermentation mounds, she explains, created to generate heat and introduce microbes into the earth. Inside each one, decomposing fish bits, corn husks, and a paste made from fermented nopal cactus. The result? A soft, springy soil base that warms early in the season and practically begs plants to thrive. She hands you a lump. It's warm. Not steaming, but noticeably alive. Like a compost muffin. You don't say that out loud, but the thought amuses you all the same. Nearby, another gardener is hunched over a strange mesh of floating baskets, reed-woven containers filled with moss and sprouting herbs. Mobile gardens, he says proudly. If the water level rises too fast, they float. If it drops, we anchor them. These baskets are also useful for medicinal herbs that require slightly cooler roots, protected from the heat of dry soil. He plucks a sprig of something minty and offers it to you. For clear dreaming, he says. Works best under a full moon and after a nap. You chew it cautiously. It tastes like memory dipped in menthol. One boy, barely 10, is showing off his pest trap garden, designed like a baked buffet. Outer rows are planted with decoy crops especially beloved by beetles. Middle rows have sticky sap from fig trees. Inner rows? The real crops, untouched and smugly thriving. You ask him where he learned that. My grandma says insects are lazy. They take the first meal offered. You make a mental note to write that on a t-shirt someday. You sit for a while with a group discussing wind protection techniques. Some build low wind walls from cornstalks lashed with agave twine. Others plant dense borders of maguey or tall sunflowers to break the gusts. Still others dig wind troughs, slightly sunken paths between rows that funnel air downward and away from fragile seedlings. Historians still argue whether these were local innovations or brought in from trade with cultures further south. The Tarascan Empire, for instance, had similar airflow designs in mountain farming. Cultural borrowing? Independent invention? No one knows for sure. What's clear is that every breeze that passes through here does so on someone's terms. You turn a corner and find a shaded bench with a view of the lake. Two older gardeners are smoking thin reeds filled with dried epizode and chatting about plant personalities. Yes, plant personalities. One insists that chili peppers grow better when ignored. The other swears that tomatoes need compliments. "I sing to mine," he says, deadpan. But only in the morning. Afternoon songs make them blush. You laugh, which seems to please them. One offers you a hand-carved amulet shaped like a seed. "For your dreams," he says. "Bury it when you're done traveling. Maybe it'll grow a story." The experimental gardens fade behind you as the canoe pulls away once more. You lie back and close your eyes, the taste of algae tea still lingering. The air smells like wet leaves and possibility. And somewhere inside your half-snoozing brain, you start to wonder. If Aztec gardeners could craft floating islands, trap bugs with sacrificial squash, and whisper sweet nothings to chilly plants, what else did they know that we've forgotten? The canoe slides further south, tracing a gentle arc along the lake's curve. The air is thicker here. Quieter, less traffic from other boats, more birdsong, more breeze. You nestle into the woven seat. The gentle swish of water against the hull lulling you into that dreamy state where the mind wanders but the eyes stay half-lidded. You're headed now toward a site that locals call the Ghost Chinampa. Not because it's haunted, though someone probably tells that story on stormy nights, but because it represents a vanished technique. Part mystery, part legend, and part overgrown relic. It's where gardeners once practiced methods that modern scientists still scratch their heads at. You step ashore onto a chinampa covered in pale, feathered grass, with clusters of plants that don't match any of the others you've seen today. There are square patches of bare earth surrounded by thick straw, like sleeping mats laid out for some earthen ceremony. At the center of each, a small, hollow depression with the remnants of burned plant ash and bone meal. This, your guide whispers, is an example of cold burning. Aztec gardeners would sometimes smolder specific herbs and grasses, never quite igniting them, to create a layer of nutrient-dense residue. The resulting soil stayed cool to the touch but rich in potassium and nitrogen, ideal for finicky root vegetables and nightshade plants. You touch the earth. It's soft, ash-scented, and oddly springy. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or a local eccentricity. Some theories suggest it originated from observing volcanic ash effects. Others claim it was sacred knowledge passed only within families. No one agrees on why it works, but it clearly does. Botanists trying to replicate it often fail unless they use the same plants and wind direction, which feels less like science and more like wizardry. Your guide kneels by a cluster of what looks like a mutant tomato plant, viney and lush but bearing striped, bulbous fruit. These, he says, are Tequitsomel, a now extinct cultivar. We think they were grown for both food and dye. He plucks one and splits it open. The juice is thick, purple-red, and stains your fingers like ink. Nearby is an even stranger sight. Elevated planting trays balanced on tripods of bamboo and obsidian-laced rock. These trays once held medicinal plants that needed minimal soil but intense sun exposure. Think of them as early botanical skylights. A few are still in use, growing tiny clusters of Kia and purslane, both nutrient-dense and notoriously picky. One theory says these platforms were also used to protect the most sacred or valuable plants from pests or thieving neighbors. Another claims they were designed for observation, letting gardeners compare sunlight patterns and growth cycles like sleepy astronomers. And then you spot a half-sunken canoe, overgrown with water mint and frogs. But inside it? Rows of herbs. Someone turned this old canoe into a mobile herb garden, floating it between chinampas for ideal sun or shade, and probably just for fun, too. You trail your fingers along its rim and imagine planting one in your bathtub back home. You'd need a lot of mint. And fewer frogs. Off to one side. A cluster of hollow logs are stacked like a pyramid. You lean closer. They're full of fermenting lake scum and corn husks, gently heating up from the inside. Your guide explains. Natural heat pockets. When placed near sensitive plants, they raise the ambient temperature a few degrees. Historians still wonder if this was done intentionally or just a happy accident. Perhaps someone noticed that the squash grew better near the compost heap and decided to turn that into architecture. Either way, it's a brilliant example of low-tech thermal regulation, no wires. No panels, just rotting stuff in clever places. You take a seat on a fallen log beside the Chinampa's edge, where someone's built a tiny shrine to Zokipili, the god of flowers, games, and sacred ecstasy. It's decorated with petals, carved seeds, and a mosaic of tiny painted beans. Someone's left a small offering, the single perfect chili pepper. You wonder what kind of prayers go with that. Maybe just, please don't let the bugs get my melons. Looking out over the ghost Chinampa, you see that it's not abandoned after all, just transitioning. Every technique here, no matter how obscure or failed or half-remembered, has left behind whispers in the soil, echoes in the way the vines curve, and lessons that still haven't been fully decoded. Before you leave, your guide shows you something that almost no one gets to see, a buried ceramic tablet, half exposed under a fig tree. On it are carved tiny pictographs showing what might be crop rotation cycles tied to the moon's phases. If the interpretation is right, and no one agrees, it means that these gardeners once planted by the tides of the night sky, tracking root growth and leaf spread according to celestial rhythms. You pause, hand on the cool ceramic, and imagine standing here 500 years ago under the same sky, whispering hopes into the dirt, reading lunar glyphs, asking the plants what they needed today. It's a humbling moment. You realize these weren't just farmers. They were philosophers of photosynthesis, monks of mulch, poets of pH balance. And they left behind more questions than answers. As the canoe pulls away again, you look back once more at the ghost Chinampa. It doesn't look haunted. It looks wise. You drift now into calmer waters. The air smells faintly of damp wood and vanilla orchids. And, okay, possibly wet duck. It's been a long day of plant magic and soil science. And you wouldn't blame yourself if you started to nod off here. But your journey isn't quite done, because just ahead is the oldest part of the system. The roots of the roots, if you will. You're headed toward one of the original Chinampa zones, long abandoned and partially submerged. It's a tangle of half-drowned trees, ivy-covered wooden stakes, and crumbling platforms overtaken by wildflowers. But if you look closely, you'll see signs of the past still hanging on, especially in the trees. These trees, mostly are hua hoots, or Montezuma cypresses, were once planted at the edges of each Chinampa to hold the soil in place. Over centuries, they've grown into twisted guardians, their massive roots forming arches and steps and cool grottos. Some even look like sleeping giants curled around the land. This area was once used to grow sacred crops, mostly for the priesthood and the elite, white maize, ritual flowers like marigolds and sempaxokittle, and rare forms of cacao. You imagine priests in feathered cloaks stepping carefully through rows of tiny seedlings, murmuring prayers as they inspect the leaves. A local elder, wrapped in a rebozo and sitting on a low stool near the water, tells you stories. Not the ones in the textbooks, the real ones. She points to a particular tree and says, "That one sings at night when the marigolds bloom." You're not sure whether to believe her, but you also notice you're not quite ready to disbelieve her either. She talks about gardening as ritual, how each seed was planted with a small offering, a breath, a drop of water, sometimes a fingernail. Not as sacrifice, but as part of the cycle. A tiny bit of you returning to the earth to say, "We're in this together." The more she speaks, the more you realize Aztec agriculture wasn't just about food. It was cosmology with a home. Each planting mirrored the calendar. Each harvest echoed a myth. The center of the Chinampa was a microcosm of Tenochtitlan itself, carefully ordered, symmetrically divine. With maize at the center like a sun. Historians still argue how much of this was literal belief versus symbolic ritual. Were they just practical farmers who enjoyed a good story, or true believers who saw their work as sacred duty? The evidence is as tangled as these ancient tree roots. Some codices hint at chants sung to seedlings. Others show diagrams of crops aligned with constellations. Was it religion? Science? A cosmic to-do list? Your guide picks a handful of ancient corn cobs, tiny and jewel-like, still clinging to a stalk growing in the wild. These, he says, are the great-grandparents of your cornflakes. You hold one in your palm. It weighs almost nothing, but somehow feels important. Nearby, you spot a raised mound overtaken by moss, with remnants of what look like clay figurines. Likely an old garden altar. You kneel to take a closer look. The figurines show maize gods with leafy hair, water deities pouring rain from upturned bowls, and a small frog with what appears to be a crown. You smile. The Aztecs really did know how to appreciate the drama of amphibians. The elder explains that these figurines were sometimes buried with seeds at the start of a new cycle, meant to bless the soil and confuse pests. Confuse pests, you ask? She nods. If you make the field look like a god lives there, bugs get scared. And honestly, that logic holds up. You wade through ankle-deep water to explore one last patch of Chinampa that's barely above the surface. The soil squelches under your feet like chocolate cake left out in the rain. Here, you find a forgotten irrigation channel, cut so precisely that it still directs water even without maintenance. It's like the ghosts of gardeners past are still nudging it along. This canal design, narrower, looped, sometimes coiled into spirals, was part of an ancient effort to create vortex motion in the water. Not just to prevent stagnation, but to oxygenate and circulate nutrients. Some modern hydrologists marvel at the design, calling it centuries ahead of its time. Others say it was just pretty. Either way, it worked. You squat down to trace your finger along the spiral. It makes you dizzy, but in a good way. Like your brain is swirling with everything you've seen, ducks as pest control, chili whisperers, floating gardens, compost muffins, and tomato plants that respond to compliments. One more thing catches your eye, a carving on a fallen tree trunk. Not letters, but symbols: corn, sun, spiral, flower, frog. It's not a message you can translate in any formal way, but somehow you understand what it says. It says, we were here. We learned things. We sang to our seeds. We made the mud beautiful. You sit quietly for a while, just breathing, just listening to the leaves. And somewhere out of sight, a frog croaks like it's in on the secret. The canoe drifts once more, this time through a corridor of flowering trellises that arch overhead like a tunnel of dreams. Vines of morning glory and maracuja wind together, creating dappled shadows that flicker gently across your face. You lean back against the edge of the boat, letting the colors blur like watercolors melting on damp paper. You're now in what could best be described as that experimental zone. Historians aren't exactly sure what this section of Chinampas was for. It doesn't show up much in surviving records, and local law calls it simply El Rincón Curioso, the curious corner. But one thing's for sure, this is where things got weird. And by weird, we mean fascinating. Welcome to Aztec horticultural experimentation, where gardeners played matchmaker between plants, tried odd pairings, and maybe even stumbled upon a few hybrids long before Mendel got excited about peas. Here, for instance, you'll find evidence of early grafting techniques. One partially petrified tree still holds the scar of an attempt to fuse chili and tomato stalks. It didn't work. Or maybe it did, and we just haven't figured it out. But the technique suggests that the Aztecs weren't just caretakers of plants, they were tinkerers. Historians still argue whether these experiments were intentional scientific trials or just happy accidents that occurred when seeds were swapped at festivals. One theory suggests that gardeners intentionally cross-planted cousins, like squash and gourds, not just for yields, but for spiritual balance. The idea being, if your food harmonizes above ground, maybe your soul does too. The evidence? A single codex illustration showing a man serenading a garden bed with a flute while holding two different beans in his palm. Interpret that how you will. You stop beside a row of raised stone beds, where piles of tiny clay tags have been unearthed. Each one is etched with symbols, some plant-like, some astrological. It's believed these were plant IDs and growth records. Basically, the first garden spreadsheets. One tag reads something like, "Maize a wind season, talk to 3 times per day." Another just has a drawing of a cloud and a question mark. You have to admire the curiosity. The guide gestures to a patch of purple-tinted amaranth, explaining how the Aztecs once painted patterns onto leaves using fermented flower dye and fine bone brushes. To track light absorption, he says with a straight face. But you suspect at least one gardener just wanted prettier salads. Further on, you find a bed of wild cucumber vines trained into a spiral, their fruit spaced at perfect intervals. The reason? Possibly aesthetic. Possibly to test airflow. Possibly just for fun. And you know what? That's enough reason, too. Then there's the mist chamber, or at least, what remains of one. A rectangular platform with a stone basin at its center and slanted reed frames on every side. When filled with water and heated by sunlight, it likely created a gentle, steamy mist. Perfect for tropical plants or for a gardener needing a spa break. No one agrees on how widespread this feature was. Some archaeologists argue it was a prestige item, reserved for the priestly class. Others believe these microclimates were key for growing medicinal herbs with fragile structures, like Hierba santa and wild vanilla. One of the beds is covered in obsidian pebbles, which your guide explains were used to reflect sunlight upwards, warming leaves from below. It's like tanning, he jokes. But for lettuce, you crouch and run your hand across the smooth stones, now warm from the afternoon sun. And you have to admit, it feels kind of genius. Nearby, another bed seems oddly sunken, with water pooled just below the surface and cattails planted in rows. This was likely a nursery for aquatic herbs and edible reeds. But there's something odd here, tiny stepping stones embedded in a spiral. Could it have been a meditation spiral, where gardeners walked in circles to calm their mind while checking sprouts? Historians don't know. But the idea of calming your mind while checking sprouts sounds oddly appealing. You reach what's clearly the pride of the area, a raised, controlled garden surrounded by logs and tall stakes wrapped in dried gourds. Hanging from them are dried seed pods, beads, feathers, and bells. Yes, bells. Wind chimes made from carved maize husks and hollowed fig bones. Every breeze sends them into soft, musical rattles. These, your guide says, were believed to attract beneficial insects or spirits. Probably both. And if nothing else, they made the place feel alive. You sit on a stump and let the gentle clinking lull your thoughts. The final touch? An old, battered gourd shell, repurposed into a cup. You sip from it, herbal tea brewed from chinampa mint, cacao husks, and a whisper of chili. The warmth spreads through your chest like sunset light. You close your eyes. Here, surrounded by experimental spirals and tomato-taming ghosts. You realize that gardening, real gardening, isn't about control. It's about listening, tinkering, wondering, failing, laughing, and maybe, just maybe, singing to your squash once in a while. Somewhere between the gentle chime of maize husk bells and the last curl of mist from the experimental plots, you begin to notice the change in tempo. The light softens. The air cools. Touched by evening. You've wandered into the transitional zone, where chinampas blur into marsh, and cultivated plants give way to wild ones again. Here, the gardens were less ornamental, less sacred, and more logistical. This was where food preservation, seed storage, and crop rotation came into focus. It's not glamorous, but it's the part that kept everyone alive. You squat beside a half-buried clay jar, its rim just poking through the soil. The guide gently clears the dirt away to reveal what was once a seed vault. Not dramatic, not royal, just practical. Inside would have been sealed bundles of maize, beans, chili, and squash seeds, carefully dried and wrapped in maguey fiber. Each farmer had their own tricks. Some used lime powder to keep bugs away. Others buried their jars near mint plants for pest control. And here's a fringe tidbit for you: some seeds were blessed by placing them under a sleeping baby for a night. Don't ask. It supposedly gave them new breath. Scholars still scratch their heads at that one. You trace the ridges of another vault and realize how much of Aztec genius wasn't in flamboyant rituals or dramatic conquests, it was in quiet logistics. Like knowing to always rotate maize with beans, not just to rest the soil, but to let the beans fix nitrogen and make everything richer for next year. Historians still debate just how scientific this knowledge was. Did they understand the nitrogen cycle? Or was it passed down through generational trial and error? Wrapped in myth to ensure compliance? Either way, it worked. That counts. You walk along a stretch of ground dotted with raised mounds, each labeled with a faded obsidian tablet. These were seasonal trial beds, rotated between crops to cleanse the soil, meaning they weren't just resting. They were actually planted with purifying crops like marigolds and wild garlic to keep fungi and worms at bay. One of the weirder features in this zone? A small mud hut built on stilts. Right in the water. Its door is barely shoulder width, and the floor is sunken with wide slats. It's explained as a drying shack where herbs and seeds were left to hang in filtered light, away from rodents and too much heat. You imagine crouching in there, threading bunches of episode while dragonflies zip past the open slats. And yes, it probably smelled amazing, like an apothecary's closet married a greenhouse. Deeper in, the soil turns coarse and flecked with ash. This was the site of controlled burns, yes. The Aztecs knew all about fire cycles. They torch certain plots once every few years to sterilize the earth, clear invasive weeds, and even release dormant nutrients locked in dried stems. Slash and burn, but with surgical finesse. You spot a sunken ring of stones filled with hardened clay. That, your guide says, was a bee bath. A shallow pool for stingless native bees, who played a vital role in pollination. And just like the floating duck coops, these little helpers had their own infrastructure. You peer inside one of the nearby hollow logs, yes. Definitely a beehive. And yes, it smells faintly of warm honey and old wood. Over in the corner of a slightly more disheveled plot, you find rows of dried calabashes, hard, green, and covered in markings. These were Aztec garden journals. Instead of parchment or paper, some farmers etched planting records and moon cycles right into the skin of the goods before they dried. Once hardened, they'd last for years. You pick one up. The etchings are barely legible, but you can just make out a date glyph, a drawing of maize, and what might be of a sad face. Possibly a failed crop. Possibly a warning. Possibly the ancient version of Lua Mondays. But your favorite discovery in this zone? A rest bench. Carved into a tree trunk and shaded by a papaya plant. Not ceremonial. Not religious. Just a seat. For a tired back and a warm squash tamale. A small luxury in a labor-heavy life. You sit there a moment, breathing in the scent of soil and ash and lime blossom. A heron glides overhead. The guide offers you a final story from this zone, that during a certain festival, gardeners would leave tiny clay figures, miniature versions of themselves, on their most productive beds. A kind of thank you gesture to the land. Some of those figures have been found buried under flood layers, still clutching farming tools. Their faces are simple, joyful, smiling, like they knew something we've forgotten. That may be the real miracle isn't in growing things. It's in growing them again. The last glow of sun dapples the water in golden ripples as your canoe glides toward the final chinampas, those on the very edge of the old empire. Out here, gardens gave way to marsh. Civilization blurred into wilderness, and even the records thin out. This zone was where nature and culture held hands, not always knowing which was leading. The birds are louder here. The air thicker. You pass by a stand of papyrus-like reeds, taller than a man and rustling in perfect rhythm. Some were cultivated deliberately, not for food, but for crafting scrolls, thatching rooftops, even weaving baskets to carry newborns. Here, gardening bled into engineering. And speaking of bleeding edges, out here the Chinamperos had to get inventive. The terrain was less stable. The current stronger. Some built floating beds tethered to rock anchors, while others tried interlacing cypress roots with woven mats to create semi-submerged platforms that rocked with the tide. Think of it as Aztec hydroponics, version 0.5. One particularly odd discovery? A series of gardens in baskets, wooden frames filled with soil and herb seeds, hung from tall poles to avoid flooding. They'd swing in the wind like strange, fragrant hammocks. Historians still argue whether these were emergency growing systems or just for show. Either way, they worked. Archaeobotanists even recovered wild fennel pollen from one basket that dated back over 500 years. Now the guide steers you toward a darkening grove, overgrown and whispery. This was where sacred plants were grown, species that didn't appear on menus but did show up in ceremonies, ointments, and myths. You pass Teonanacatl, the so-called flesh of the gods, a kind of psilocybin mushroom that the priests considered divine. Not eaten by everyone, mind you, only certain classes, during controlled rituals. You crouch beside a plot of smooth, dark earth that once housed Tilmatli, the original vanilla orchid. Carefully hand-pollinated, treasured for its scent, and believed to soothe angered gods. Some say it worked on humans, too. One early Spanish friar swore that sniffing vanilla during arguments prevented blasphemy. Historians remain unconvinced, the guide mutters with a smile. Farther on, a small circle of carved stone basins still holds faint stains of pigment herbs, cochineal cactus, annatto, and indigo. These weren't food plants, they were for dyeing fabrics, feathers, and ceremonial masks. Color wasn't just beauty, it was identity. And a single garden here could feed the palate of a whole temple. Just off the path, a copse of sacred cacao trees catches your attention. Their trunks are short, knotted, almost stubborn, but the fruits hang like swollen jewels. These weren't used for casual chocolate drinks, mind you. No, this cacao was ritual grade for offerings, contracts, even funerals. One story tells of a priest being buried with 3 roasted cacao beans in his mouth so the underworld would taste kindness. Nearby, you find a wooden cage, still standing. Its slats half sunken in moss. Not for animals. For wind. This was a song trap, designed to channel breezes through hollow reeds, producing soft, flute-like tones. To keep the spirits company, the guide says. Or maybe just to make weeding more pleasant. And then, because the Aztecs never ran out of ideas, there's a final, circular bed surrounded by mirrored shards of polished obsidian. It's not for vanity. These mirrors were used to watch plant growth without bending over, and perhaps to reflect sunlight onto shaded stems. Some also believe it served a more magical purpose. To trick the gods into seeing double, your guide says, so one crop became 2 in their eyes. You gaze into one of the fragments. Your reflection blurs and splits in the ripple of water. 2 of you. Or just enough of you to keep a single corn stalk company. Toward the very edge of the zone, nearly swallowed by reeds, stands a weathered pole carved with spiral glyphs. Its top once held a rattle or flag or perhaps a guardian effigy, no one agrees. But it marked the boundary where the Chinampa world ended, and the wild lake took over. You float there a moment. As the wind hushes and frogs begin to tune their nighttime chorus. And in that silence, you realize something: the genius of Aztec gardening wasn't just its science or beauty. It was its humility. It never fought the land, it conversed with it. It never claimed control, it borrowed time. It didn't conquer the elements. It harmonized with them. Like a lullaby hummed while planting. Or a child's whisper to a sprout. And now, the stars begin to prick the sky, soft and curious, like seeds on black soil. The air is cooler now. Almost still. Only the occasional splash of a fish or the far-off flit of a night bird disturbs the mirror-like surface of the lake. You're drifting again, slow and steady. As the canoe eases toward the final floating garden on this journey. It's not a showpiece. It's not a sanctuary. It's what you'd call a legacy plot, passed down, rebuilt, and replanted through generations. You run your hand through the low branches of a chili plant that's seen better days but still holds onto its last crimson pods. Here, in these final rows, the layout is less orderly, more sentimental. It's the garden of memories, where crops were grown more for tradition than yield. That pumpkin vine curling lazily around a driftwood stake. It's the same cultivar an old woman said her grandmother swore by, because it made the softest tamales. That clump of wild greens tucked under the maize? For teas and foot baths, says the guide. And for pretending to do something when the doctor says there's nothing left to try. You step onto the moist soil and crouch beside a stand of flor de calabaza. Or squash blossoms, edible flowers used in stews, stories, and sometimes funerals. Some of the petals are already curling inward, tucking themselves in for the night. And now, let's talk about the gardeners themselves. The Chinamperos weren't nobles, and they weren't warriors. They were ordinary people, stubborn, patient, and endlessly inventive. They rose with the birds, worked with the mud, whispered to seedlings like they were children, and laughed at ducks with hats. You've seen their footprints, literally, pressed into the drying bricks of old causeways. And their names? Lost. or remembered only in family stories that start with, "My tatarabuelo once grew a maize plant taller than a priest." Historians still argue whether these gardens were fully communal or privately managed under tribute quotas. But the truth is messier, as truth tends to be. Likely both. Probably neither. Maybe it changed with the moon or the mayor. One fringe theory even suggests that some chinampas were deliberately let go wild as spiritual offerings, small patches of generous neglect, where nature was allowed to reclaim a fraction of her lease. A thank you to the gods, or a lesson to the children. Or maybe just a moment of rest. You pause beside a twisted mesquite that grew through a now collapsed fence. It clearly wasn't supposed to be here. But it made it. It belongs now. That, in itself, feels like the final lesson of the gardens, that life persists. Even in odd places. Even in mud. A soft wind brushes your cheek as you turn to the water. Fireflies flicker in the reeds. The guide doesn't say anything now. He knows the story is over. You step into the canoe once more and lie back, watching the dark canvas of the sky unfurl above you. Somewhere, in the distance, a dog barks. Somewhere closer, a duck makes a sleepy honk. Classic. And the canoe drifts. Wind down, final 300 words. So now, as you settle deeper into your blankets, your breath sinking with the quiet rhythm of this drifting boat, let your mind exhale with the stillness of the chinampas. Picture the dark water, smooth and steady, cradling each floating garden like a mother holds a sleeping child. No edges. No urgency. Just presence. Let the night deepen around you like soil thickening beneath ancient roots. You're safe here. Adrift in a world that mastered the art of quiet growth. Feel the soft hush of reeds brushing your skin, the distant lullaby of frogs and insects singing under the stars, and the slow, steady heartbeat of a civilization that learned to grow beauty from mud. The stories of the Aztec gardens may be full of mystery and invention, but right now, they are simply still. Still like your thoughts. Still like your body, relaxing more with every breath. So allow the last images to fade into gentle shadow, pale squash blossoms closing for the night. A canoe tethered to a sleeping tree, a handful of soil warm from the sun. There's nothing else you need to do. Nothing else you need to know. Just drift. And breathe. And sleep.